people. And yet, the reason people buy newspapers is that, well, I think it's an evolutionary thing, you know. These emotional times in our lives, like births when you have children, like getting married, or when you're diagnosed with a serious disease, and bereavements in families, these emotional moments in people's lives are what matter more than anything else to them. And the reason they matter, and the reason that they're emotional moments, is because it's all tied to our evolution. It's all tied to, if you've got a bit of extra information, if you go and buy a newspaper that gives you a story about how somebody's been injured in a serious way, or maybe somebody's been killed, that little extra bit of information gives you a competitive advantage in a world that's driven by natural selection. And that's why we like gossip. You know, the more you know about your environment and other people and the things that are going on around you, the more chance you have of being successful and of your children being successful. And that's deep down inside us. That's been built into us over a period of billions of years. So those emotional connections that I was describing earlier are really powerful because they are rooted deep down in our biology. That's why they are such an important way of communicating with people, because it's fundamentally who we are. It's right, and you've experienced it in this room today yourselves as well, by the demonstration that we had from Dimitri, the croissants you've been eating. Even in this room, people here are emotional beings as well. So again, my call to you is to use both those rational arguments when you're dealing with the politicians directly, when you're putting a case together, writing a paper and it's science-based, and to use those emotional arguments the rest of the time. You've got to use both, as we heard earlier. Okay. I think that's just about everything I want to cover. So I think I wanted to make sure we had time for a bit of debate and for you to fire a few questions and say some of your own things. So,
right, I'm deeply sceptical about many things. There are good reasons to find out whether things are true or not. But my scepticism is in politics. In this particular instance, local parties, Lib Dems, Conservatives, Labour, and others write to me, send their circulars, saying what wonderful things we're doing and how we're doing this and they aren't doing that. Yeah. And this is where politics falls. It's a division. And representatives represent a particular view which is taken, a party view, shall we say, of something. I can't turn to my MP and say, Glenda, this is what I believe, will you represent me in this? Now, she has about, for instance, identity cards, but she just did a bit of digging for me. But my politicians can come to me and say, this is what I believe, and this is the thing for which I will move forwards. Now, my view, as a politician, should we say, might be the same as another party's view on something. But because I belong to Party 1, my view is that of Party 2, have difficulties unless I might, for instance, lose the whip or some such thing. This is what's wrong with politics in general, that it is party-driven, there are agendas, and even where people don't get the free vote they really ought to be getting for everything. So you stand up, you say you're a Lib Dem, that's fine, and you may hold true to many of the aspects of liberal democracy. I'm not going to argue with that, but what I'm going to argue with is you're going to pick up a point and say, this is what I believe. I've got no reason to doubt you, of course. Then, should the Central Party cadre come to you, the whips come to you and say, Darren, this is what it's about. This is how we're going to look at this particular issue. What are you going to do? Are you going to be a member of the party and therefore vote alongside? Or are you going to go with the thing for which I have chosen to support you on to become my MP? That's where I see that party politics as being very dangerous and very nasty. It should be representative maybe of an overall view that you're Conservative or Labour or Liberal Democrat as a generic thing, but have whipping and not allowing people to go with their particular viewpoint obviously destroys party politics, but it does mean people are better represented.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. And the trouble is, though, that if you don't have that, then you don't get elected.
Right. Yeah.
And so, given that, if you just think for a moment about the political upheaval there's been in the UK over the last couple of years, we've had two really quite major things happen to UK politics. we've just come through a recession, a banking collapse, and the unprecedented amount of money that's been pumped into the banking system. But more significantly even than that, we've had the expenses scandal. There are presently several members of Parliament who are awaiting criminal trial because they've been charged with committing fraud, having claimed on their expenses things that allegedly they weren't entitled to. And at the same time, large numbers of MPs have had to repay expenses. You know, it's been in the newspapers for the best part of well over a year anyway. And despite that, despite the depth and strength of feeling that there aren't any demonstrations in the streets. There aren't people threatening revolution. Life is carrying on pretty much as it always has. And the reason for that is that deep down inside, most people are pretty comfortable with the way that the system works today. I don't think it's going to radically change. We might get a bit of changes around the edges. We might see some proportional representation, or certainly a change to the voting system. Maybe the alternative vote system might come in a few years' time. The government has committed itself to a referendum on asking people whether they want to go to the next stage with changing the voting system. We might see some reform in the House of Lords. Maybe we'll see all members of the House of Lords elected. I mean, let's face it, you know, Britain claims to be the mother of all democracies, and yet we're one of the few countries in the world where the second chamber isn't wholly elected. People get into the House of Lords as a matter of privilege on the basis of either still there are many that are there because they've inherited it, and there are others who've just been given the job by party leaders on the nod. So I think democracy is very much here to stay and will strengthen. I can't see that changing anytime soon. And given that the way politicians get elected isn't fundamentally going to change either, I think we will have the party system. It's going to be with us. I mean, if it doesn't change now, it isn't going to change, is it? After everything that's happened over the last couple of years. So what we have to do is try and find a way of making the best out of what we got. And that does mean that from time to time, and what it's about, I mean, you know, you'll know this with your marketing background, I'm sure. You have to have image. You have to have things being the same from one member of a political party to the next. It's like chains of McDonald's. You know, if you go into a branch of McDonald's, you know exactly what you're going to get. You know exactly what a Big Mac looks like. They're always the same. And that uniformity, that predictability, is part of what creates a brand. So if you've got a political party, whether it's the Conservatives, Labour, or anybody else, that political party has a brand that they need to maintain. And because they need to maintain that brand, that's why you have whipping. Because there's a certain expectation. They have manifestos that have been agreed at the party conference. They've had leaflets pushed through letterboxes, and people have voted for political parties on the basis of those leaflets, and therefore there is a whip in Parliament to make sure that when the vote actually comes around, the MPs vote in the way that the leaflets originally said they were going to vote. And if you've got some maverick who says, no, I don't believe in that, then it's not really fair on the electorate, because they were only elected because of the promises that were made. So that's why you have a whipping system.
So the personalities of the MPs are unimportant?
Well, it varies. I mean, you know, certainly amongst the leaders, personalities are important, because a lot of people will vote based on personality rather than any rational assessment of the policies.
But for the run-of-the-mill MP?
But for the run-of-the-mill MP, by and large, they will follow. I'll give you an example of following political lines. I've got something here, actually, when I can just bring my mouse back together. Here we go. Right. So I mentioned the human fertilisation and embryology bill earlier. And this is how the political parties voted when the bill was going through Parliament. There were 6 separate votes related to human-animal embryos. And you can see on each of these votes a fairly consistent pattern. The Tories always had a majority against the legislation permitting the creation of human-animal admixed embryos. Labour were totally consistent in favour of it to varying degrees. 91% here, 77% here. And the Lib Dems also were consistently in favour of it, although to a lesser degree than Labour. And the reason you've got this difference between Labour and the Lib Dems